Okay, well, hello everyone. This is Richard Kravitz. I'm the director at UC Center Sacramento. Welcome to this weekly webinar as part of our speaker series. Today's talk is at the intersection of two really critical issues for Californians and for all Americans: housing and homelessness on the one hand, and structural racism on the other. While I suspect the focus will be on the present day, these problems have deep historical roots, and I look forward to hearing from our speakers about how they're connected and what we can do about it. Just by speaking of connections, on July 23rd, New York Times journalist Connor Doherty and UC Berkeley professor Carol Gallant will be here for an informal conversation about housing and homelessness in California before, during, and after COVID-19. So we hope many of you can join us then. And more information about these events and others is available on our website at uccs.ucdavis.edu. So now a brief word about our speakers. Dr. Kelly Ray Knight is a medical anthropologist and associate professor in the UCSF Department of Anthropology, History, and Social Media, and also affiliated faculty with the Center for Vulnerable Populations at San Francisco General Hospital. Her federally funded research explores, among other things, the health, social, and policy implications of homelessness in California. She's a faculty lead for addiction medicine and structural competency education at UCSF, and her award-winning ethnography, Addicted.Pregnant.Poor, published by Duke University Press, has been used to advocate for decreased stigma and increased services for women with substance use disorders who experience homelessness. So Dr. Knight is joined by Mr. Derek Paul, a fourth-year medical student at the University of California, San Francisco. He was named a 2018 David E. Satcher Health Disparities Research Fellow for his work mapping the role of structural racism in susceptibility to housing insecurity and homelessness. Together with mentors, he studies the relationships between homelessness and health at the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly Ray Knight and Mr. Derek Paul. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, everybody, for having us. It's a big pleasure to be here with the group and to talk about our work. Today, we'll present something that we actually put together for the Homelessness Leadership Council for several regions in the East Bay, and was presented at Oakland City Hall kind of right before the COVID pandemic hit. But I think, you know, all of these topics are increasingly important for us to talk about and think about together. This is the story of our investigations behind what's behind the racial disparities and who experiences homelessness. It's how we came to join with, I think, many of you to think that ending homelessness is going to require a racial equity lens and approach. And before I even get started, I also want to say and acknowledge that I am not a person who has experienced homelessness myself. And I come at this as a researcher, and I come at this with an enormous amount of privilege to approach this in an academic way and to think about policy in that way. And so we do this in hand in hand with our study participants and our brothers and sisters who are actually, you know, giving us their wisdom through their lived experience, sharing with us, and then we try to inform our policy recommendations from that. So I'll start with our first slide. You know, with north of 2 million people experiencing homelessness each year in the U.S., I think these might be numbers that some of you are familiar with, that Black identity African Americans overrepresented by 3, Pacific Islanders overrepresented 2.6, are Indigenous and American Indian communities overrepresented by 2.5. the Hispanic and Latino ethnicity overrepresented as well. We focused our studies mostly in Oakland, California, where the numbers are quite similar. A lot of us are looking at this and saying, you know, what's going on here? We're saying that 24% of people in Oakland are identify as Black, but they make up 70% of those who are experiencing homelessness. You know, I think this, I remember in November, there was just a group of very brave mothers who took over an effectively abandoned house in Oakland and demonstrated this point better than any of us in academia can, that something very serious is happening. And I'll emphasize that the disparities in who experiences homelessness are worse than the disparities in who experiences poverty. There's something else that makes Black Americans, that makes people of color from various racial groups, ethnic groups, more susceptible to homelessness. There's rising awareness of this issue, not rising awareness in the communities that have always been aware of this disparity, but I think rising awareness amongst policymakers and more focus on what are the drivers behind it. The two major reports in 2018 that I'll highlight, the LA Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness, came to the conclusion that racism in various ways is intertwined with homelessness. They established a racial equity initiative within the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority. And then I'll also talk about the SPARK report, the Supporting Partnerships for Anti-Racist Communities, which studied populations in Atlanta, Columbus, Dallas, San Francisco, Pierce County, Washington. This was a qualitative analysis that focused on structural racism and how it affected broader social networks and families. So, and those have been covered nationally. As we get into this conversation about racism and homelessness, we have to center ourselves in a long history of racial segregation and homeownership exclusion. We have to know that not only when we talk about redlining, the FHA refusal to insure the mortgages of Black families, but also that there's a history of racially separate public housing, exclusionary zoning in the suburbs that's been called white flight, that the courts have in the past upheld HOA racial restrictions and covenant evictions, that police departments locally, including here in California, in the Bay Area, you know, where I live now, failure to stop mob violence against families that were integrating into different communities, school board boundaries that were aimed at segregation, highway planning to demolish African-American middle-class neighborhoods as they started to emerge. This is a quote from Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law. We've created a caste system in this country with African-Americans kept exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. Although most of these policies are now off the books, they have never been remedied and their effects endure. I can't say it any better than that. We also have to think about this history of wealth suppression. Not only what I just talked about, which is decades of exclusionary lending, but how that transforms in the 2000s into predatory mortgage lending to African Americans who also had who then had their wealth wiped out more than anyone in the Great Recession. You know that disparities in the labor market, disparities in unemployment and income, you know, which flow into wealth, are underlying all of what we'll talk about today. We have to think about the $23 billion racial funding gap for schools that comes from you know, a school system that's funded in large part by property taxes, and we'll get more into homeownership as we go on. I will turn it over to Dr. Knight to give us a little bit more background.
Great. Oh, great. Oh, thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. We had one last quote that we wanted to share about the history of wealth suppression, which is when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, the Black community owned a total of 0.5% of the total wealth in the United States. Slaves were forbidden to own anything, and the few freed Blacks living in the North had few opportunities to accumulate wealth. 150 years later, that number has barely budged. So next slide, please. So I'm here to sort of piggyback a little bit on what Derek has already shared in terms of the really critical historical context to be able to understand the policies and histories and experiences of Black Americans that contribute to the increased vulnerability to homelessness. And one of those key factors that I've spent a lot of time studying is the US war on drugs, policing, homelessness, and drug policy. I have a quote here to share from Michelle Alexander's fantastic book, The New Jim Crow, where she outlines the relationship between criminality, the criminalization of substance use and people who use substances, and the criminality of people who are experiencing homelessness with larger forms of discrimination that Derek has outlined in terms of wealth, employment, and education. And she says, rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color, quote, criminals, and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind, legally left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all areas that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunities, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a Black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended the racial caste system in America. We have merely redesigned it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we see in relationship to that is the disproportionate number of people of color who are incarcerated for possession or sales, even though the rates of sales and substance use in the US do not vary by racial and ethnic category. And that is to say that people of color are not more likely to use or sell substances in the US, but represent 50% of the population that is currently incarcerated according to these statistics, which are a little old now, they're from 2015. And I'm gonna circle back when we share our two papers. Next slide, please. When we share our two papers today to sort of, we're gonna sort of outline two of our work, work that we've done together in Oakland that Derek's gonna discuss and led the analysis for on the experience of older homeless adults. And then a paper that came from my work, my long-term work, looking at the intersection of structural racism, housing, and reproductive justice for women experiencing homelessness, that we published in the New England Journal of Medicine. So I'll let Derek get started with the first paper.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be sharing this work with you. This is a multi-year effort that led to the publication of racial discrimination in the life course of older adults experiencing homelessness, results from the Hope Home study. And I'll start by talking about what Hope Home is. The Hope Home study is the health outcomes of people experiencing homelessness in older middle age. It's a longitudinal cohort study in Oakland, California, meaning we follow folks over time. It's actually one of the largest studies in the US that's in this area. 350 participants and an additional 100 participants in 2017. These are folks who were experiencing homelessness, that were 50 and older at study entry, and this is funded by the National Institute on Aging. The median age at study entry was 57. 44% of the study participants were not homeless prior to age 50, and 80% were Black American, and 77% of men. A purposeful sampling of the population in in Oakland. So, what did we do here? We conducted in-depth interviews with 65 Hope Home participants, and these were fairly open-ended interviews. They explored childhood, first episode of homelessness, relationships with family, and the experience of being homeless. But I'll tell you that the interviewers did not ask participants explicitly about race or their experiences with racism. That was not the objective of the study. What I'll tell you is that what ended up coming out of our analysis were experiences with racism that were patterned across the 65 interviews, and that allowed us to draw themes and do a thematic grounded theory analysis in terms of what were shared experiences amongst the participants and how were those experiences interplaying in terms of increasing susceptibility to homelessness. I think we have a short amount of time today, so I'll jump right in. Many themes emerged related to race and racism. The first one was having experienced overt discrimination in childhood. One participant described being part of school integration efforts, and I'll tell you that in these quotes, what's in brackets are descriptors that are details from the longer interview that might not be in this little snippet of conversation. One participant told us, "It was during that Brown versus Board of Education. They put us in a school in B, predominantly white neighborhood, which was insane. Between the train station and the school, there were a bunch of white guys waiting with bats and chains. The cops would look at us and see what was going on. They would just drive away. What scared me is that one black guy they caught and beat him so bad that he just had a hole in his face, all his teeth, everything was gone. His lips, everything, it scared me so much. I said, I'm not coming back to this school." We think about Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, but we also know that school integration happens at different paces around the country. It reminds me of Kamala Harris talking about and being fact-checked as being accurate when she said that she was in the second class to integrate Berkeley schools. All of us have lived through and continue to live through quite dynamic racial climates in the US. In this quote alone, you have an overtly racist policy being struck down, attempts at an anti-racist policy with school integration, and racist backlash from the community. There's so much here. Criminal justice discrimination was maybe the most common theme for our participants who were Black identifying. It's one of the most well-studied forms of structural racism. We saw that it was very common for our participants to be incarcerated and for that to affect their housing in a really vicious cycle. One participant said, "I signed up for Section 8 before and we got denied. I probably got denied because I have a felony record. I went to jail for something I didn't do." Another told us, she just looked at me and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We don't house criminals. So if you have any type of outstanding warrants or anything, that will affect your housing." These are just two of many, many stories. We heard of folks who were arrested, incarcerated for things that they told us in our interviews that sometimes misidentified. Sometimes there were things that they told us, "Hey, I did this, and then I was incarcerated, and here's how I've been sentenced to homelessness on the outside of this." I think, we have to keep in mind Black men 6 times more likely to be incarcerated, Black women 2 times more likely. And there's, many, many studies that show that what's behind this is racial discrimination. When we look at the group of folks that have had wrongful convictions overturned, Black Americans are 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted. We know that when it comes to drug use, financial crimes, that the racial identities actually commit these at similar rates. So, but yet there's harsher sentencing. And this is the way that Kelly already alluded to this with the Michelle Alexander quote. This is the way that racism survives in a on the surface colorblind system. You criminalize the racialized group, and then you discriminate against the criminals. I'll leave that there, and we'll come back to this. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with my Zoom here.
You want me to bring up the presentation?
No, I think
There,
I think it's okay. I can't see everybody. Can everybody still see me?
We
see
can.
you, but we can't see the slides.
You can't see the slides?
No.
Okay. Let me try to, something happened. Let me try to share again and see.
Oh yeah, they're back.
Slides are back?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. Job loss precipitated homelessness for all racial groups. But in terms of what the cause of that job loss or difficulty in finding a job, that varied. Here's a story from one of our participants. I was working in W, and there was a lot of racial tension. And when they had cutbacks, most of the minorities got let loose, laid off. And some of us was hired before the other people. We had a real nice crew, and you can just tell when it's racial. And white guys that came on after us stayed, but me and the Asian guys got cut loose because they said cutbacks and stuff. But I think that guy I was working for, I think he just was racist. You know, employment discrimination is complicated, especially in the modern day. I think we've all heard about the studies that show when you send out resumes with white sounding versus black sounding names, we know how devastating that disparity is. There's also discrimination against people with criminal justice involvement. There are studies that show that white folks disclosing a criminal record are more likely to be hired than black applicants without one. So it's more than just racist policies at play. There's this racist ideology of inferiority that comes, and I think it's one of the most infuriating things that we can discuss today. And that's because there is a history of black bodies being lionized to as having higher capacity to work when the results of their labor flowed towards white power structures, but characterized as inferior when the fruit of labor flows to themselves. Talk about health disparities a lot at UCSF. We talk about damage to the individual, but health disparities and their long-term outcomes can be devastating to the social network. Here are a couple of stories from our participants. All my close friends are dead, which is sad. Like I said, in the 50s, in the 60s, and the 70s, it was doing drugs, alcohol. A lot of my friends died of alcoholism or drug overdose or just dead. Another participant, she said, and other people that I knew, I heard, who were close to my same age, to my age, I mean, they were just dying, not from gunshot wounds or anything like that, just from illness. Loss of a family home was a very common story. Family members that were housing insecure or using subsidized housing were common. Wanting to stay with family, but family members not being able to help was the narrative. Here's one story. Participant tells us, but there's really no one that actually sees me come in and go out of my daughter's apartment, because when I'm there, I don't make a lot of noise. I go in, I stay inside, and I just take it easy. So, and she doesn't have a lot of friends in the building that come in and say, hey, your dad's here. So a lot of people don't know, and I don't know if there's a security camera. I really don't want to jeopardize my daughter's housing. You know, I think there's a big social network effect. There are studies that show that when white individuals are facing housing insecurity, they're a lot more likely to have a family member that can house them temporarily. And basically what we saw in the case of a lot of our participants were that they didn't have, their family members were in almost the same situation or on the brink of the same situation as they were in, and they didn't have that to fall back on. I'm going to skip right to the model that we published and just quickly put together the things that we've said, which is that criminal justice discrimination led both to a temporary ineligibility for subsidized housing, but also a lifelong discrimination against criminal records in the private market that creates a limited access to housing. That was like the dominant narrative that we saw. You know, that was made worse by employment discrimination, which limits income. Have to emphasize that criminal justice discrimination also affects the individual that we're talking to, but their social networks as well. So depleted social networks, not being able to stay with a family member because the family member was incarcerated. That was part of a common narrative. Depleted social networks being worsened by the health disparities and premature death in early, late adulthood. And having family members who were themselves renters with restrictions on guests who face fear of eviction, and the way that limited family wealth and home ownership was behind a lot of this not having a safety net to fall back on when you get in this situation where you have limited access to housing. So I think I'll leave that there, and Dr. Knight is going to talk about the next study.
Great. Thanks, Derek. So I'm going to provide a little bit more historical context to the next study that I want to share with you, which is really a case study from a book that I wrote, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But wanted to sort of bring into the conversation the intersection of structural racism, reproductive health, and parenting, and homelessness, to recognize the intersection of the fact that the targeting, the racial targeting of African Americans for drug arrests that I mentioned earlier, and those statistics, how that particularly affects women and parenting people in the US, and then specifically some research in the Bay Area. So next slide, please. So when we look at who is actually in jail in the US, it's really important to recognize that 80% of the women who are jailed in the US identify as mothers or currently parenting women, and that's something that is largely invisible, largely goes unrecognized in terms of women who are experiencing incarceration, largely because of drug-related charges. Next slide, please. Where we see an intersection is also in the role that's a really well-established research that's been spoken much more in the popular media, and certainly in health disparities research for people who work at the intersection of reproductive health and health disparities, is the contribution of structural racism to the incredibly, tremendously disparate rates of maternal mortality among Black women in the US. This is just a slide from the CDC offering those statistics. And it's important to note that maternal mortality for Black women actually occurs across economic and educational backgrounds. So it is not specific only to poor women or to structurally vulnerable Black women, that it actually occurs across, which really speaks to the experiences of medical discrimination and discrimination within clinical care, and also within the organization of clinical or treatment adequacy by neighborhood. So some geographical differences there, but it still holds true. I'm going to focus in, since this talk is looking at the intersection of homelessness and structural racism, on the experiences of pregnant and parenting women who were homeless. Next slide, please. So we can see, these are really current statistics, that when you think about family homelessness and you think about the children under 18, compose 60% of the people experiencing homelessness in families, and African Americans accounted for 52% of people in families with children experiencing homelessness. So this, again, we're seeing the racialized disparities translate into the family context. the work that we just spoke about, that Derek just spoke about, focuses on older homeless adults and focuses on sort of the life course of experiences of structural racism and racial discrimination. But we also see this currently happening with families. Next slide. So I've done a body of work, about 10 years of work, some of it federally funded by NIDA and some of it locally funded by foundations here in the state of California, to try and really understand the intersection of structural vulnerability in relationship to cash entitlements, to policing, arrest, incarceration, and reproductive health and other health outcomes for women who are experiencing homelessness. And I wanted to share a brief case from our New England Journal paper today. Next slide, please. So this case comes from a book that I wrote that was mentioned earlier called Addicted, Pregnant, Poor, which is an ethnography of pregnant and parenting women who were experiencing homelessness in San Francisco over a 4-year period. And I followed 19 women who had 23 pregnancies during that period, who were all moving between unsheltered status and SRO hotel, unpublicly subsidized SRO hotels in the Mission District in San Francisco. Next slide. I looked really carefully and got to know the women and the housing environments in which they were trying to manage a healthy pregnancy and then move on to possibly parenting within this context. It's just a few pictures to kind of indicate the conditions, the housing conditions and built environments that was happening in. Next slide, please. Collectively, we took this work and created a perspective for the New England Journal of Medicine that came out last summer that highlights a case, and I just wanted to share it with you and then talk a little bit about some of the policy and research repercussions. So this case talks about this is a quote from how a participant who's experiencing homelessness, a Black woman who's experiencing homelessness and an obstetric emergency is interpreted and sort of shot through both the medical system and also the housing and entitlement and substance use treatment systems. So from this perspective, we hear that the medical providers described this woman as a 39-year-old African-American woman, opioid user, possibly homeless, preterm birth at approximately 24 weeks of pregnancy, most likely due to cervical insufficiency resulting in a neonatal demise. So this original excerpt is the story of a loss, a pregnancy loss. This is what this person who I was very close with and worked with for over 10 years experienced at the bedside. This is her provider talking to other medical trainees. And the provider said, "This sadly is a typical case. These women are in such a bad way. It feels like there's very little we can do. They should be given an IUD along with their methadone. It's terrible to say, but it might be a blessing that the baby didn't survive. It probably would have just ended up in the foster care anyway after going through opioid withdrawal." So these are the kind of experiences where you see the long-term implications of structural racism, of welfare reform targeting African-American women, historically, of lack of access to treatment for opioid use disorder and limited access to treatment for opioid use disorder, as well as the devaluation of reproduction that Black women so often experience as a form of reproductive injustice in this country, which contributed to maternal mortality. Also contributing is the fact that this is a homeless woman experiencing homelessness. So she left the hospital because she had lost her pregnancy. She lost access to her methadone maintenance treatment. So she went through opioid withdrawal and returned to street heroin use because she no longer had preferential access to her treatment, returned to homelessness, avoided prenatal care in a subsequent pregnancy, and had a second obstetric emergency resulting in a stillbirth. So lost 2 children in the course of the period that I saw her, and experienced both the racial discrimination that you see outlined here, as well as the broader structural racism that's been well documented by Helena Hansen and other researchers that show that the sort of extremely low rates of access to life-saving treatments for opioid use disorder, such as methadone or buprenorphine treatment, which sit around 40% across all populations in the US, or even lower among African Americans opioid use disorder. So it's even harder for African Americans to get access to treatment in this country, and that is directly due to a historic legacy of structural racism, criminalization, and the war on drugs. Next slide, please. So some of the policy solutions that we've taken up locally are to work actively at this intersection, both within the context of medical education. So the case that I just shared with you in the New England Journal is now standard medical education during the UCSF medical students' OBGYN rotation. So while they're on clinic clerkship for OBGYN, we read this case and we discuss the implications, particularly for care of women experiencing homelessness and substance use disorder co-occurring, and really focus on how the experience can be changed, both structurally in terms of providers understanding and access to treatment, particularly for people experiencing homelessness, and also in terms of interpersonal discrimination that may happen at the bedside, as I shared. I just wanted to highlight some of my colleagues' work because this is certainly a massive collective effort at UCSF, and there are many people who are working at the intersection of poverty, homelessness, and reproductive justice. And these are just a few of my colleagues that are working in collaboration with the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative, working specifically on homelessness, and also making sure that women experiencing incarceration are not returning to homelessness, and rather creating alternative solutions for family unification, for treatment access, for parenting support as needed. Next slide. On the national level, I think there's been many efforts that I actually feel really quite promising about in terms of thinking about the intersection of homelessness, structural racism, and reproductive justice. One of the things is to make access to opioid use disorder treatment a very low threshold, and there's been efforts, including the ED Bridge program in the state of California, that are working actively in OBGYN environments to identify women at high risk for housing instability and poor reproductive and treatment outcomes to be brought together, and a large organization of harm reduction, legal advocates, and media who've been able to sort of change the narrative on how prenatal harm is talked about, and particularly the specific risks that women who might be returning to homeless to either unsheltered or marginally housed status while they're trying to parent, their risks involved. So next slide. And we return now to Eric to wrap up our talk, and then we can do some discussion.
So as we get into our recommendations and conclusions here, I like to just take a second to remember that anti-racist policies tend to be unpopular before they're passed and reach mass approval later. A lot of times because they're driven by unfounded fear and the ideologies and ideas that we've been talking about today. The second thing is that anti-racist research and efforts focusing on the groups that are most overrepresented, they tend to really help all people. We have to make sure to design them that way. And I think Ibram Kendi points this out in one of his books. He points to the Civil War as an extreme example of how racist policies and protection of racist policies have tons of collateral damage that's often, for example, poor white folks. So in terms of our recommendations, in a world where Black Americans are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a crime, homelessness can't be what's waiting on the other end of an incarceration sentence. We have to decrease barriers to federally and locally regulated public housing, prevent discrimination in the private markets too. Second, people talked about employment and housing discrimination as part of their pathway to homelessness, but they didn't have recourse. So proactive protections and recourse are difficult but important things for us to focus on. in major cities, Black renters are 5 times more likely to be evicted than white renters. So we have to work hard to keep people housed. We need rent control, new affordable housing, protection from eviction that just won't happen on its own. We need to invest in initiatives aimed at alleviating health disparities. Dr. Kushal, who's not here with us today, but is one of the senior authors on the paper that I worked on with Dr. Knight. She always says housing is the best medicine. Our study shows that goes both ways, that keeping people and their families healthy may also be key to keeping them housed. So if we see racial health disparities and life expectancy gaps, and we know that staying with family can also protect you against homelessness, we need to invest more in the health of our communities. And the last I'll say, if the average Black family sold everything they own, they'd have about $9,500 in their pocket. That's compared to $130,000 for the average white family, and much attributable to the 30-point gap in racial gap in homeownership. So we need to deploy new policies that protect against exclusionary and predatory mortgage lending to reverse this long history and the effects of redlining. We'll have to promote homeownership for a generation of people with incentives and tax policies. Luckily, I think we can do that the same way we did it for everybody else. So I'll come to our last slide here and say that ending homelessness should unite everyone who thinks our class inequities and structural racism that our class inequities have gone too far and that structural racism has gone unreparated. I think it's the utmost illustration of both things. We need to ensure that as we go forward, that our efforts do not unintentionally worsen racial inequities, and we would just, emphasize that our conclusion, as we've come through our research, is that an anti-racist lens informs policies that can contribute to ending homelessness for everyone. Colorblindness is not the answer, and it hasn't worked. And I'll leave it there.